They sang about barrooms, neon lights, and heartbreak. But for these country legends, the bottle wasn't just a lyric. It was a way of life. Some hid it well. Others let it burn down everything they built. In this episode, we uncover 10 more country stars who were drunk all the time, from the stage to the shadows. Their talent was undeniable, so was their addiction, and for many, the price was far greater than the applause. Kris Kristofferson was always more than just a songwriter. He was a poet, a Rhodes Scholar, a former Army pilot, and a rebel who changed the face of country music. He wrote songs that defined generations, like Sunday Morning Comin' Down and Help Me Make It Through the Night. But the man behind the words lived much of his early fame with a drink in his hand, sometimes celebratory, often destructive. In the 1970s, as Kristofferson's fame soared, so did his drinking. He was charismatic and wildly intelligent, but also unpredictable. Friends recalled that he could write a masterpiece in the morning and be blackout drunk by nightfall. His heavy boozing became part of his mystique, the rugged outlaw intellectual who could hold court at a bar until sunrise, arguing philosophy over whiskey. But behind the image was a man using alcohol to numb pressure, expectation, and unresolved pain. His drinking bled into his acting career, too. While he landed major roles in films like A Star is Born, directors often had to navigate around his erratic behavior and alcohol-fueled mood swings. He admitted in later interviews that he could barely remember filming parts of certain movies due to how much he drank. He even performed while drunk, sometimes delivering brilliant sets, other times barely making it through a song. In the 1980s, his personal life suffered. His marriages crumbled. His friendships strained. And while he never descended into the kind of public collapse others experienced, those close to him saw the toll. Eventually, Kristofferson sobered up. He credited his recovery to family, spirituality, and a deep desire to preserve what was left of his voice and his mind. In the years that followed, he became a calmer, wiser figure in the music world, often reflecting on the years he spent trying to outrun himself. His later work carried a quiet, weathered truth, the kind that only comes from surviving what could have easily killed him. Jerry Lee Lewis was rock and roll fire poured into a country soul, a wild man at the piano, a preacher's son with the fury of 1,000 broken commandments. Nicknamed the Killer, he was as famous for his scandals as he was for his music. And behind the fiery performances and chaotic life was an unrelenting addiction to alcohol that fueled both his fame and his destruction. Though best known for early rock hits like Great Balls of Fire, Jerry Lee later reinvented himself as a country star in the late 1960s and 70s, scoring a string of #1 hits on the country charts. But even as he climbed back into the spotlight, he was unraveling behind closed doors. Lewis drank constantly, whiskey, vodka, whatever was within reach, and his temper was legendary. Promoters, fellow musicians, even family members approached him cautiously, never sure if they'd get the charming Southern boy or the raging drunk. On stage, he could be electric or erratic. Some nights, he'd play piano with his feet and set crowds on fire. Other nights, he'd curse the audience, slur through his lyrics, or storm off mid-show. The bottle had him, and it never really let go. His personal life was just as volatile. He married 7 times, one of those to his 13-year-old cousin, a scandal that nearly destroyed his career. Many of those marriages were marked by alcohol-fueled fights and domestic violence allegations. 2 of his children died tragically, and some of those closest to him described him in his later years as a man hollowed out by loss, rage, and liquor. Lewis also suffered numerous health crises linked to his drinking, including bleeding ulcers and near-fatal collapses. Even so, he never stopped performing, never stopped drinking. He lived fast, reckless, and unapologetic. A man who never once asked for forgiveness, only whiskey and a spotlight. When he died in 2022, he was one of the last surviving founders of rock and outlaw country. But behind that legacy was a trail of wreckage, most of it soaked in booze. Mickey Gilley was the king of the urban cowboy era, a suave crooner with a velvet voice and a nightclub empire that helped bring country music into the mainstream. But behind the bright lights of Gilley's club and the polished hits like Room Full of Roses and Stand By Me was a man who, for much of his life, leaned heavily on alcohol to navigate fame, stress, and personal pain. Born in Mississippi And raised alongside his cousins Jerry Lee Lewis and Jimmy Swaggart, Jilly grew up in a world where music, religion, and vice were always colliding. He began performing in bars and clubs early, and drinking quickly became part of the routine. In the rough-and-tumble honky-tonk scene of Texas, alcohol wasn't just accepted, it was expected. And Mickey delivered on both fronts, the show and the shots. As Jilly's club exploded in popularity in the 1970s, eventually becoming the backdrop for the hit film Urban Cowboy, the pressure to maintain the brand grew. Mickey was now more than a singer. He was a business mogul, club owner, and public figure. But behind the curtain, he was drinking more heavily, using alcohol to cope with the demands and the growing sense that the machine he'd built was spiraling out of control. Those close to him described a man who could switch from charming host to sullen recluse once the crowd disappeared. He would often drink late into the night, even after performing or managing business deals. His marriage suffered, his health declined, and by the late 1980s, as the urban cowboy trend faded, so too did Jilly's grip on his empire. Eventually, Jilly began stepping back. He acknowledged his struggles with alcohol later in life, admitting that for years he used it as a way to silence the noise and the grief. After a serious fall in 2009 left him temporarily paralyzed, Jilly spoke publicly about turning inward, reassessing his choices, and focusing on healing. He returned to performing in his later years, more mellow but still sharp, leaning into nostalgia and connection rather than pressure and pace. While he never fully escaped the effects of alcohol, he managed to steer his story away from tragedy, ending not in collapse, but in reflection. Billy Currington came into the country scene with a beachy smile, smooth vocals, and chart-topping hits like People Are Crazy and Must Be Doin' Something Right. His sound was laid back, often celebrating simple pleasures, cold beer, good times, and freedom. But beneath the easygoing image was a storm brewing, and alcohol played a far more serious role in his real life than his feel-good lyrics ever let on. Raised in Georgia by a single mother, Currington had a rough childhood marked by abuse and instability. He found refuge in music and, like many before him, in the bottle. While he didn't make headlines early in his career for public meltdowns or arrests, those who worked closely with him noticed the patterns. He drank heavily on tour, sometimes isolating himself after shows, slipping into long stretches of silence and mood swings. But his struggles broke into public view in 2013 when he was arrested for making terroristic threats and abuse of an elderly man following an alcohol-fueled rage incident near his Georgia home. He was charged with felony counts, later reduced, but the incident shattered his clean public image. His mugshot, eyes tired and distant, became a symbol of the unraveling behind the scenes. In interviews afterward, Currington remained mostly silent on the details, but insiders pointed to alcohol as a key factor in the outburst. He pulled back from the spotlight for a time, canceled shows, and began reworking his team and priorities. Though he returned with more music in the years that followed, the same carefree vibe never fully masked the darker chapters behind it. His music still mentions drinking, often wistfully, romantically, but fans who know his full story hear a different note now. A warning, a memory. A man who lived a little too close to the lyrics he sang. Whether he has truly left the bottle behind remains unknown, but his place among country artists who let alcohol bleed into their reality, dangerously and publicly, is undeniable. Sammy Smith had a voice like warm smoke, deep, aching, and unmistakably real. Best known for her haunting 1971 hit Help Me Make It Through the Night, she was one of the few women in the outlaw country movement to gain real recognition. But behind that soulful delivery was a woman quietly unraveling, numbing years of pain and disillusionment with alcohol that slowly dimmed her light. Smith came into country music as something of an outsider. Born in California and raised across the Southwest, she left school at 11, married at 15, and began singing in honky-tonks to survive. Her breakthrough came when she recorded Kris Kristofferson's song, transforming it into a chart-topping classic. Her voice conveyed loneliness so convincingly because she knew it firsthand. But while her success brought fame, it also brought exposure to the darker side of the industry. Endless touring, personal betrayal, and an exhausting pressure to conform in a male-dominated world. Smith never did. She was fiercely independent, resistant to industry polish, and increasingly drawn to the outlaw crowd, Willie, Waylon, and the rest. With them came creative freedom and hard drinking. Unlike some of her male peers, Smith's struggles were rarely publicized. She didn't cause scenes or wreck hotel rooms, but friends and family said she drank heavily in private, often alone. The weight of broken relationships, an industry that aged women out quickly, and the emotional toll of constant performance became too much. Alcohol became her escape. As the 1980s rolled in, Smith began to fade from the spotlight. She kept recording, kept touring small venues, but the sparkle had dulled. Her voice remained powerful, but her energy was waning. She relocated to Oklahoma, became deeply involved in Native American causes, and focused on her children. Still, the quiet addiction never fully left. When she died in 2005 at just 61, tributes poured in from country music's inner circle. Many described her as underappreciated or forgotten. But those who had seen her at her peak knew she was one of the finest voices of her generation, one who perhaps deserved more from the world than it gave her. And like so many others, she tried to fill the gaps with the bottle. Sammy Smith didn't crash loudly. She faded softly, but her voice and her pain still lingers in every note. Stonewall Jackson was a pillar of the Grand Ole Opry, a quiet giant whose name stood for tradition, twang, and unshakable Southern pride. With hits like Waterloo and Don't Be Angry, he carved out a steady career from the late 1950s through the 70s, becoming one of the longest tenured members of the Opry. But behind the scenes, Stonewall's struggles with alcohol painted a very different picture, one of frustration, resentment, and quiet decline. Unlike the wilder outlaws of his era, Jackson carried himself with restraint. He dressed sharp, kept his hair tidy, and rarely caused public scandal. But that didn't mean he wasn't hurting. As the country music industry evolved, leaning towards slicker, younger acts, Stonewall felt increasingly sidelined. Though he remained loyal to the Opry stage, his presence in the charts and on radio steadily disappeared. And with that fading relevance came the bottle. According to colleagues and insiders, Jackson drank heavily during this time. He wasn't a violent drunk, but a brooding one, prone to long silences, bitterness, and isolation. Fellow musicians noted his growing disillusionment, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s, when he felt the Opry was pushing older artists out. In 2008, he even filed a lawsuit against the Opry, alleging age discrimination. It wasn't just about lost performance slots. It was about losing his identity, and alcohol only deepened that loss. He still showed up to perform, but his drinking left its mark. His voice, once rich and commanding, began to waver. His performances grew more erratic. He stopped recording new music altogether. And while he never made headlines for public outbursts, those around him understood that the man who once stood tall on the Opry stage was quietly drowning in resentment and regret, and in bourbon. Stonewall Jackson died in 2021 at age 89, still revered by a generation that remembered when he ruled the radio. But his later years were marked not by celebration, but by slow estrangement, from the industry he helped build and from the clarity he once carried. He never raised hell like some of his peers, but the bottle still won. Justintown's Earl was born into music and into madness. The son of the legendary Steve Earle, he inherited both immense talent and a legacy of self-destruction. With his sharp songwriting and haunting stage presence, Justin carved a name of his own in the Americana and alternative country scenes. But like his father before him, he battled demons that clung tightly, and alcohol was always one of their sharpest claws. From a young age, Justin was exposed to chaos. His father was deep in addiction during much of his childhood, and Justin followed in those footsteps early. By his teens, he was already experimenting with alcohol and drugs. It wasn't recreational. It was survival. In interviews, he would later admit that drinking helped him disappear, helped him quiet the noise inside his head, but it also nearly destroyed him before his 20s even began. As he launched his music career, Justin's blend of vintage soul, ragged folk, and country sincerity earned him critical acclaim. Albums like Harlem River Blues and Midnight at the Movies revealed a writer wise beyond his years and wounded beyond his age. Offstage, he tried to stay ahead of his addiction. He entered rehab more than once. He spoke openly about his sobriety journey. and for a time, it looked like he might beat the cycle. But alcohol and other substances never stayed far. His behavior on tour was erratic. Some nights he stunned audiences with intimate, flawless performances. Other nights, he slurred lyrics, forgot verses, or didn't show at all. Those close to him described long stretches of isolation, dark moods, and repeated relapses. He wanted to be better, but he also carried the weight of generational pain. In August 2020, the music world was rocked by the news of his death. Justintown's Earl was only 38. The cause? An accidental overdose of fentanyl-laced substances, compounded by alcohol. His death echoed the very themes he'd written about for years: sorrow, longing, and the thin, dangerous line between relief and ruin. His father, Steve Earl, later released an album of Justin's songs in tribute, calling it both a goodbye and a reckoning. For many, Justin's story is among the most heartbreaking in modern country. A brilliant light dimmed far too soon, and a reminder that some battles never end, even when the music does. Jerry Jeff Walker was the heart of Texas outlaw country, a bohemian drifter, folk poet, and the voice behind the classic Mr. Bojangles. He wasn't just a singer-songwriter, he was a way of life. With a cowboy hat on his head and a bottle in his hand, Walker built his legend in smoky bars, dive stages, and campfire circles, and alcohol was as much a part of the journey as his guitar. Originally from New York, Walker found his true home in Austin, where he helped pioneer the progressive country scene of the 1970s. Alongside Willie Nelson, Townes Van Zandt, and Guy Clark, he carved out a raw, unpolished alternative to Nashville's glossy product. His shows were unpredictable and rowdy, fueled by tequila, beer, and a winking defiance that fans adored. But behind the charm and rambling charisma was a man walking a very fine line. Walker drank with enthusiasm, and often with abandon. Friends and fellow musicians joked about his legendary binges, but many quietly worried. He'd stay up for days, drink until sunrise, then stumble onto the stage and deliver either brilliance or chaos. And somehow, that unpredictability only added to his appeal. He was living proof that you didn't have to play by the rules to matter. But the bottle took its toll. His relationships frayed. His health declined. Albums became less frequent. He missed gigs, made enemies, and disappeared for stretches of time that no one could explain. There were whispers of interventions that failed, of friends trying to pull him back from the brink. But Jerry Jeff was stubborn. He lived how he wanted, and he drank the same way. In his later years, he mellowed slightly, turning to acoustic storytelling and mentorship of younger artists. He spoke more openly about his regrets and the wreckage left behind. He still drank, but with less fire. The wilder edges dulled. The cowboy still rode, but a little slower. Walker died in 2020 after battling throat cancer. His loss hit Austin hard. The city had lost not just a musician, but a cultural soul. Fans remembered him with laughter, with tears, and with a kind of reverence reserved for those who burn brightest and quickest. He left behind songs full of life, sorrow, and truth, and a cautionary tale wrapped in charm, whiskey, and the myth of the free spirit. Hank Williams III was born into country music royalty, the grandson of Hank Sr., the son of Hank Jr., and the heir to one of the most iconic and troubled legacies in American music. But while the voice and bloodline were unmistakable, Hank III carved his own path, darker, louder, and far more chaotic. His style fused country, punk, and metal. And like the men who came before him, alcohol was both fuel and fire in his life. From the beginning, Hank III rejected the clean image expected of the Williams name. He wasn't interested in radio hits or Nashville approval. Instead, he built his following in underground clubs, dive bars, and outlaw festivals, where drinking wasn't just part of the culture, it was the culture. His lyrics were unapologetically raw, laced with drinking, drugs, rage, and self-destruction. But they weren't fictional. They were diary entries set to a steel guitar and distortion pedal. He drank constantly, on stage, off stage, in interviews, and during recording sessions. Whiskey was his closest companion, and fans came to expect a certain level of mayhem at every performance. He'd show up hours late, slur his words, or perform marathon sets in a fog of alcohol and sweat. His body bore the damage, rail thin, jittery, aged beyond his years, but he rarely apologized. In fact, he wore the chaos like a badge of honor. Behind the scenes, the picture was messier. He feuded with record labels, refused to compromise, and often alienated bandmates. His drinking fueled his aggression, especially when it came to anyone trying to control his art. Interviews with those close to him painted a portrait of a deeply talented, deeply tormented man, one who never fully emerged from the shadow of his name or the bottle he carried in it. Unlike his father and grandfather, Hank III has largely vanished from public view in recent years. His output slowed, his tours stopped, and rumors swirled of worsening health and isolation. Some say he's working on new music. Others say he's retreated completely. Whatever the truth, his legacy is cemented, the last, loudest outlaw of the Williams line, a man who didn't just inherit the family voice, but also the family curse. Earl Thomas Connley was a quiet giant of 1980s country music, a soulful voice behind 18 #1 hits and a deep thinker in a genre that often favored simplicity. But while his music soared, his personal life slowly unraveled behind the scenes, and alcohol played a subtle but steady role in his eventual retreat from the spotlight. Known for hits like Holding Her and Loving You, Fire and Smoke, and Once in a Blue Moon, Connley brought an emotional complexity to country radio that few others dared to touch. His songs weren't just about love and heartbreak. They were about emotional paralysis, longing, guilt. And that rawness didn't come from nowhere. As his fame grew in the 1980s, so did the pressure. Connley was a perfectionist, often obsessing over lyrics, arrangements, and even the smallest details of a performance. That perfectionism, combined with the unrelenting demands of touring and recording, led him to alcohol as a coping mechanism. He wasn't a loud or wild drunk. He was a withdrawn one. Friends described him as vanishing after shows, retreating to hotel rooms with a bottle, not to party, but to disappear. By the early 1990s, the drinking had worsened. He began canceling shows. His voice, once smooth and commanding, started to crack. Industry insiders whispered about his health, his mood swings, and whether he was burning out. Eventually, Connley stepped away from the business altogether, not with a scandal, but with a silence. For years, he disappeared from the public eye. Some thought he'd retired. Others assumed the worst. When he did reemerge in the 2000s, it was quietly, doing select performances, writing again, and speaking openly about the toll that fame and the bottle had taken. He admitted to battling depression, isolation, and exhaustion, much of it self-medicated with alcohol during his peak years. Earl Thomas Connley passed away in 2019 after a long illness. He was 77. Tributes poured in from artists across genres, many calling him the most underrated country singer of all time. But behind that praise was a deeper truth. He was also one of the genre's most quietly tormented, a man who gave everything to his art and spent the rest trying to find peace away from it. Tôi đã hoàn thành xong nhân vật thứ 10 trong danh sách tiếp theo.